So I come to the topic of loneliness, as perhaps some of you do also, through personal experience. In fact, I could even go out on a limb and guess that each person in this room has had some experience of loneliness at some point in your lives. Though it's a topic that we shy away from talking about, except maybe with close friends or family members, loneliness seems to be an almost universal part of the human experience. Now, perhaps a few of you are just here to learn about loneliness for the sake of your parishioners. I won't invade your privacy on that. But if you have had an experience of loneliness at whatever level of intensity or duration, know that you are not the only one. When I first began experiencing loneliness at a level that I felt the need to talk about it with my therapist, I thought it was something that was personal and private, that my more outgoing friends and colleagues were immune to. But the more I lived with and paid attention to my own loneliness, the more I became alert to hearing others mentioning that they too were struggling with feelings of being left out, feelings of isolation, or struggling to make meaningful connections. And so the topic began to feel like a calling, inviting me to go deeper. Loneliness has taken different forms at different stages in my life. Back when I was single in the years before and after seminary, there were times when the only physical touch I experienced the whole week was shaking hands and passing the peace at church on Sunday morning. I was keeping plenty busy. I had plenty of people to talk to. I was working 2 to 3 jobs at any given time. But with my closest friends living hundreds of miles away, I felt the absence of intimacy in my daily life. But loneliness is not limited to the single state. When I got married 5 years ago to a wonderful man, I was excited because I finally had the romantic partner that I had been searching for so long. And we did begin each day to talk about our work and our lives. We would go on dates and discuss our hopes and dreams for the future. But I found that my social life was growing deep in one direction only. And I really missed the circle of female friends that had been such an important part of my life in seminary and other times along the way. At times when I would confide in somebody that I was struggling with loneliness, especially because I had moved to a new part of town and didn't have any connections in our suburb, well-meaning people would try to encourage me by saying, well, don't worry, as soon as you have kids, it'll be easy to meet people who are in the same stage of life. But that was little comfort in the years before we were ready to have children or when we were trying unsuccessfully to get pregnant. And it's true that since my daughter was born 19 months ago, I have met a number of other moms of young children, mostly thanks to Facebook groups through which I've been able to set up play dates. It's a good thing. And yet, just because we're in the same stage of life doesn't necessarily mean that these folks are kindred spirits, that we're able to connect at a deep or meaningful level. And even if there is that potential, friendships take a long time to cultivate, and very few, if any, have yet blossomed into the kind of meaningful friendship that feeds my soul. So what is loneliness? For my purposes tonight, I want to exclude a few things from the definition. Loneliness is not introversion. Introverts and extroverts can both experience loneliness, though I suspect that the circumstances of those experiences might vary quite a bit. And many introverts are perfectly happy with their level of social engagement, connecting with 1 or 2 close friends and spending ample time in fruitful solitude. Loneliness is not the same as shyness, though the social anxiety associated with shyness can lead to some sense of isolation and loneliness. They're not identical. Loneliness is not the same as singleness. As in my own story, being single in the right circumstances can offer you ample opportunity to connect. Being married might not have the same opportunity to meet your particular social needs. For my purposes, loneliness is not about meeting a particular criteria for a certain number of people in your social circles or a certain number of contacts or depth of conversation. Loneliness, in my view, is a more subjective experience. And loneliness is not the same as being alone. It was theologian Paul Tillich who said, loneliness expresses the pain of being alone, and solitude expresses the glory of being alone. The same state can be experienced very differently. For my purposes, I'm defining loneliness as the subjective feeling of lacking sufficient meaningful connections with other people. Now, that might mean that you have many connections, many relationships, but they're not going deep enough to meet your needs. Or it might mean that you are not in touch with enough people, enough relationships in your life to have your social and emotional needs met. In my observation, clergy are at particular risk for loneliness for a number of reasons. And I think perhaps the foremost reason for many of us is that our sense of professional boundaries and ethics make us appropriately cautious about forming friendships with members of our congregations or other ministry settings. We know that those folks are going to need to turn to us as pastor, as minister at some point. And so we hold back from making ourselves vulnerable to them as we might with other friends. That can lead to a sense that we are constantly giving of ourselves to the people with whom we spend the most time and not receiving back at the same level of mutuality as we would hope for. We also may find as leaders that in the face of anxiety or dysfunction in church systems, we are responsible for being the adult in the room. And that can make us feel lonely because if everybody else is running around like a chicken with their heads cut off, we might want to go home and have a fit as well. But we are charged with holding the space and seeking to keep casting the vision as leaders, even in the face of others' anxiety. And finally, when we are in a role in which others may put us up on a pedestal and then scrutinize everything we say or do, holding us to a higher standard than others, that sense of constantly being in a fishbowl can make us feel isolated and disconnected and unable to be vulnerable with the people we serve. When we look to Jesus, our example not only for a leader in ministry, but also for a fully human life, we see somebody who cultivated solitude and time alone in prayer with God, who also cultivated relationships with a close circle of friends. And yet even Jesus was not immune to loneliness. On the night before he would die, he went to the garden to pray with his friends and asked them to stay awake with him. And we hear in the anguish of his cry, "Can you not stay awake 1 hour with me?" All of the ways in which we can feel disappointed and let down and alone if we have turned to the people who follow us and tried to rely on them for support. So if we can't get our needs met within the congregation in a reliable way, where do we turn? Now, many of us may have close friends among the clergy covenant community, and Orders Retreat for many can be an opportunity to reconnect and re-strengthen those relationships or to build new friendships, and I hope that it is that for many of you. And yet, when it comes to our day-to-day lives, it is so easy to get sucked into the demands of ministry in our particular setting that our connections with our friends and colleagues may be one of the first things that we let slide if we're not careful. If we look to the wider community, there are a number of other challenges. Those who itinerate may find it difficult to build deep friendships and connections if they know they're going to be moving in a few years. Most of us are working long hours, most weekends, many evenings, and that can make it difficult to get involved with community organizations or to pursue social hobbies. And finally, the sheer uniqueness of our calling. On the rare occasion when we interact with an acquaintance who sees eye to eye with us or shares our passions in some area, we may find that they are intimidated or just plain mystified by our sense of vocation, our commitment to the church, our spiritual life, all of the things that are part and parcel of who we are as ministers. So what is at stake if our social and emotional needs for connection are not being met? Well, in studies of isolation, which is one dimension of loneliness, physical health is at risk. It is on a par with such major concerns as high blood pressure, lack of exercise, or smoking in terms of being a risk factor for illness and early death. That's depressing, right? In other studies of social exclusion, the feeling of being left out, which is a slightly different dimension of loneliness, we find that actually our cognitive functioning and our behaviors in interacting with other people also take a turn for the worse. And so this means that along with the general population, we are not able to be our best selves if we are experiencing persistent loneliness. But because of our sacred trust as ministers, even more is at stake. Novelist Thomas Harris has said, "Nothing makes us more vulnerable than loneliness except greed." And if our social needs are not being met in healthy and appropriate ways, we are vulnerable to the temptation to get those needs met in inappropriate ways. And that might include crossing boundaries, whether with parishioners or with others, or it might include unhealthy coping mechanisms. And that runs the gamut from Netflix binge watching to addictive behaviors and substance abuse to other things that are even more dangerous to our own well-being and to our trustworthiness as leaders. Of course, none of you are doing any of that, I know. So is loneliness just another cross that we bear when we seek to commit our lives to serving God? Does God even care that one of the results of our following this calling is that we so often feel isolated and alone? In the second chapter of Genesis, we find that loneliness is the first thing God sees in the created world that God declares is not good. And God goes to great lengths to create a fitting companion for Adam, someone with whom Adam can have meaningful connections. And so I believe, and I think we can trust, that God does care about our loneliness, and God affirms our human need and desire for connection. Now, in my reading and research on this topic, because that's what I do when I want to go deep, is I read a lot. I've come across two essential views of loneliness. They're quite distinct from one another, but I believe that they are both true and that we do well to hold them in tension together. The first perspective sees loneliness as a psychosocial issue, and this is a view promoted by psychiatrists, sociologists, and others who have a kind of scientific mindset about it. And they identify contributing factors such as genetics, which set each individual's needs for connection at a particular level, our family environment in which we grow up, which may or may not meet those needs in meaningful ways, the values of the society in which we live, including the cult of busyness, which says that it is a virtue and admirable to be so busy that you have no time to spend with your friends. And the other social value is the myth of the Lone Ranger, which says that the outsider is the best person to lead the community to a new way of being. And therefore, if you are feeling like you are a little bit of an outsider, you're probably doing it right. Trouble is, nobody really can do it all on their own. And so those myths have some risks within them if we're not aware that we're making decisions because of them. And so our personal choices around whether and how to engage with or step back from our relationships and social networks are influenced by these other contributing factors. In this perspective, the remedies for loneliness include reality checking your thinking. Am I feeling left out because I'm reading the mind of somebody who I think is intentionally excluding me? And might there be a different way to interpret that behavior? Or have I decided that I prefer to step back and not engage because it's too risky, but the result of that is the life that I do not want? Also, then, of course, we need to make time for both our established friendships and finding ways to connect with new people. And finally, a recommendation is to engage with our social networks in person as often as possible rather than only through technology. Now, technology is not all bad, and in many situations it may be the best substitute for face-to-face interaction when that is not possible. But if it comes down to the question of whether to sit and text with a friend or to meet them for coffee, being there in person will meet our physiological and social needs better every time. Dorothy Day sums up this perspective when she said, "We have all known the long loneliness, and we have found that the answer is community." The other perspective comes from theologians and poets, and Henry Nouwen is the author who I have focused on for this perspective in his book, Reaching Out, the Three Movements of the Spiritual Life. He focuses in on a couple of issues. One is that the feeling of being alone, of not being able to live the life of any other person, but going through our own life within our own mind and body, that is universal. Everybody has that feeling. But we are in trouble when we are so afraid of that feeling that we run away from it and we constantly seek distraction from it. The other issue he identifies is we have this belief, he calls it a false expectation, that someone else will be able to take our loneliness away. And in fact, he says when we go into relationships expecting that that person will solve the problem of our loneliness, it becomes much harder to be vulnerable and intimate in that relationship. In fact, he says, no friend or lover, no husband or wife, no community or commune will be able to put to rest our deepest cravings for unity and wholeness. Now that might sound discouraging, and it's clearly in conflict with the previous view, but Nouwen says that the remedy is to turn inward. Instead of running away from our loneliness and trying to forget or deny it, we have to protect it and turn it into a fruitful solitude. The movement from loneliness to solitude is the movement from the restless senses to the restful spirit, from outward-reaching cravings to the inward-reaching search, from fearful clinging to fearless play. And when we do stop running from our loneliness, we have the potential to see, in the words of a student of Nouwen's, to see loneliness as a threshold instead of a dead end, as a new creation instead of a grave, as a meeting place instead of an abyss. And Nouwen's advice to those struggling with loneliness is do not run, but be quiet and silent. Listen attentively to your own struggle. The answer to your question is hidden in your own heart. But how do we actually do this? How do we turn our loneliness and the struggles that we have into that fruitful solitude? An approach that I have found valuable in my own experience comes from a mindfulness-based technique called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. And this is described in a book called The Happiness Trap. The first step and a key part of mindfulness is to cultivate an observer mind, which is to say that you notice the thoughts passing through your mind. And then you notice that you are noticing them. In other words, you take a step back and you recognize that the thoughts going through your mind are neither necessarily a reflection of some objective reality, nor are they the sum total of who you are. Because we get caught up in this idea that the thoughts in our minds are the trap because they are true. But when we can step back and say, some thoughts are helpful and some thoughts are not helpful, and thank you, mind, for bringing that up, but I'm going to set it aside right now, then we get some healthy distance on what's happening. The second step is to accept that loneliness is a normal human emotion. It's not a sign that there's something wrong with you. When we are afraid of our loneliness or we think that it indicates a problem, we might struggle with it. We might run away or try to hide or try to bury it. But if we accept that it is simply one emotion among many that come and go through our hearts and minds and bodies and lives, then we are released from some of the struggle. And so decide when loneliness strikes that you will pay attention to what you are thinking and feeling at that time. So now that you're not struggling with it, you can make room for your loneliness. You can become curious and ask yourself some questions about it when it happens. What is happening in my body right now? What circumstances seem to have triggered this feeling at this time? What is my first impulse on how to respond? In fact, you might even personify your loneliness and address it directly and ask it questions. So, loneliness, where do you come from? How can I help you? What are you trying to tell me today? And you can trust that if you become aware of the issue that the loneliness is trying to bring to your attention, when you either make peace with that issue or do something to change it, the loneliness will come and go much more easily with less pain and struggle. The second part, relating to the commitment part of ACT, is at a time when you are not in the midst of the pain of acute loneliness, identify your values and goals around both solitude and relationships, and choose one or two actions that you plan to take. Set a timeline and write down what your plans are. Post them somewhere that you will see them, or set reminders. Your smartphone can be your best friend in helping you check in and see whether you've followed through on your plans with this. If you're not following through in the way you intended to, offer yourself some grace, but assess, reassess, reset your goals if necessary, and repeat. I have come to believe that loneliness is functional. It does bring to our attention something beneath the surface that needs us to work on it. But I also believe that when we make room for loneliness, it can offer us some gifts. One is self-knowledge. We become better acquainted with what our own social and emotional needs are, and we can begin to ask ourselves, how healthy are my relationships with God, with myself, and with others? We can also ask, what would my life look like if I were no longer lonely? What is it that I'm trying to move towards? There's the gift of self-reliance. We learn that we have the capacity to live with loneliness, but also to reach out from our loneliness, to initiate contact with others. We find that we have more resources within us than we knew. The gift of vulnerability is one that Brené Brown has brought to many people's attention through her books, and if you haven't read them, I really recommend them. It is a gift that makes possible intimacy and deep connections with others. When we let down our guard, we give others permission to do the same. Though it can be scary, it is worth the risk. Loneliness can also bring a gift of time and space for God. Now, we've already said that busyness can be one of the reasons that we become lonely, because we don't make time for relationships. But loneliness can indicate that there is some kind of gap in our circles of connection. And I invite you to consider that when that loneliness comes up, to use that as a cue for prayer, to connect with the God of love, to know that God is not necessarily going to rescue you from the midst of that loneliness, but that God is with you in relationship in the midst of it. And God will be with you as you work to turn your loneliness into fruitful solitude, and as you try to connect with others. And finally, every form of suffering has the potential to give birth to compassion for others who suffer, whether in the same or in different ways. I have sought to share with you a little bit about loneliness, not as an expert or as somebody who has succeeded in overcoming it, but as a fellow sufferer and companion on the journey. And I'd like to close with a poem from the 14th century Persian mystic Hafiz. Don't surrender your loneliness so quickly. Let it cut more deep. Let it ferment and season you, as few human or even divine ingredients can. Something missing in my heart tonight has made my eyes so soft, my voice so tender, my need of God absolutely clear. May it be so for you and for me. Amen.